So good morning, everybody, and I want to welcome everybody to the second day of the DGA Graduate Conference. My name is Scott. Some of you may know me and others may not. Just to kind of let you know, I'm going to be your moderator today. I am a second-year master's student here at the University of Calgary, and if you're interested in yesterday's talks but did not make them, they were recorded, so they will be posted up onto hopefully the CLARE YouTube channel, probably within the coming week. I'm not sure the exact timeline on that until we get all of the edits and everything done, but if there is a certain talk that you were really interested in and didn't get a chance to see it, they will be posted on the YouTube channel. Just so everybody knows that these talks are recorded. If you have a question later on and don't want to have your face recorded, then just let us know in the chat and we can stop the recording. Questions that are typed will be on the recording because we'll say them out loud. So before we begin the introductions of our panelists today, I'd just like to take this moment for land acknowledgement and welcome to the University of Calgary. I would like to also take the opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising of the Siksika, Piikani, and the Krenare First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, Wesley First Nations. Also, the city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. So moving on from here, just a quick recap on today's events. We have three panelists this morning, after which we will have a bit of a lunch break and then a workshop which commences at 12:30 this afternoon, which will be hosted by Dr. Lisa Hughes, our very own, here at the University of Calgary. And she'll be doing a workshop on defining and practicing strategies for interdisciplinary public engagement. I would highly recommend going to this because, and those who know Lisa know she's a phenomenal teacher and it will be very good. This afternoon, after the workshop, we'll have about a half-hour break. And then at 2:30 to 3:30, we have our closing speaker, Marina Fisher, who will be talking about how to make classics relevant today, a numismatic case study. So with that, we'll move on to our speakers. Our first speaker today is Marika Strano. Marika comes to us from Italy. After a bachelor's degree in international communication and a master's degree in modern literature and philology, Marika started a research for her PhD project in comparative literature that concerns the presence and the influence of Giacomo Leopardi, and the most important Italian author of the 19th century, had on James Joyce's masterpieces. Marika's interests range from classical philology, with a particular focus both on Petronius and Apuleius novels, and on the reception of Greek myth in the Italian and Irish literature, to modern Italian, Irish, English, and American authors. So that's a lot of literature.
Yeah.
So with further ado, I'd like to present Marika and her topic on Samuel Butler, James Joyce's Odysseys, two modern masterpieces with an eye on the future.
Yeah.
Yep, you're good.
And this is amazing. So good morning, Canada, and good afternoon to everybody. And thank you again, Scott, for your kind presentation. And I really wanna say thank you to all the the organizers for giving me the opportunity to participate in this very interesting conference. So as you can see, my presentation today is entitled Samuel Butler and James Joyce's Odysseys, two modern masterpieces with an eye on the future. So the aim of my presentation basically is try to find an answer to two questions. So is it possible to include Samuel Butler among James Joyce's main sources? And if yes, which are the aspects that characterize Butler's work, and which of these are relevant in James Joyce's Ulysses? To answer both these questions is partly the library of James Joyce in Trieste, here in Italy, in which there was a copy of Homer's Odyssey, Odyssey by Samuel Butler, and partly is Richard Ellman, one of the most important Joyce's biographers, who in his essay Joyce and Homer recalls that the Irish author read also in other important Butler's works, like the humor of Homer, as well as Huon and his Huon revised. Are important all Butler's articles and essays on the Homeric Odyssey, where the author finds space several times to affirm his particular, let's say, particular, if not radical, position about Homer's Odyssey. So as you can see, Thomas Eliot defined James Joyce Ulysses as a book to which we are all indebted and from which no one of us can escape. And we think that the main source, if not the only source of Joyce's Ulysses is Homer's Odyssey. Well, it's not true, definitely not true, because we can find also Eugamon Syrian Telegony, Virgil's Aeneid, Victor Berard, and Francis Bacon. From Berard, Richard Ellman tells us, Joyce patiently established geographical details and made his poem like Homer's melting pot of races, and this is one of the main aspects not only of James Joyce Ulysses, but also of other masterpieces like Dubliners, Finnegans Wake, and so on. From Francis Bacon, he found both the voyage and the voyager to be symbolic, but it's from Butler that James Joyce saw in the poem an extrapolation of Homer's autobiography, for which he could more or less substitute his own. From these words, we can affirm that Samuel Butler was an important source as an author, but also as a translator of the Homeric Odyssey. So in the introduction of the translation of the Odyssey, which Butler claims to have translated into English, pros for the use of those who cannot read the original. And this is an important point because Joyce is one of the receivers who because he was able to understand and read Latin and not Greek. So this is important to say. And here the English author, Samuel Butler, summarizes the authors of the Odyssey, saying that the Odyssey was written by a young and unmarried woman from Trapani, who can be identified with Nausicaa. The entire Odyssey is set, as I said before, in Trapani and the Egadi Island. And the Odyssey consists of two distinct poems: The Return of Ulysses and the story of Penelope and the suitors. And here there's an important difference because James Joyce Ulysses contains 18 episodes. Don't say Justinian, I was saying chapters. 18 episodes, and it has a tripartite structure: Telemachy, Odyssey, and Nostos. So this is the not basically is one of the difference. Anyway, in the author's preface, Butler writes that I do not care whether the Odyssey was written by a man or a woman. All about I care is the knowing as much as I can about the poem. So these are Butler's words. But as Sarah Darr tells us in his fundamental contribution, An Epic for the Ladies, contextualizing Samuel Butler's theory of the Odyssey, Butler's search for the source of the Odyssey, its human source of beauty, led him to approach the Odyssey by first searching for its authors in our case. So this is one of the first contradictions we find in Samuel Butler. Anyway, in a letter dated June 3, 1886 to his sister May, because another important source of to understand, the poet is important is epistolary, like it happens with James Joyce. We have the letters of Joyce that are one of the most important sources to understand the author, but I think it happens with all the authors of every literature. In this letter, commenting on a libretto, perhaps let's that Butler entitles Ulysses, say that is in this time, and this is the serious work dealing with the wanderings of the real Ulysses. So is in the Ulysses, in Butler's Ulysses, that we have the wanderings of the real, if there's a real Ulysses. And Butler's Ulysses was defined by Tim Whitmarsh like a bizarre libretto, perhaps less bizarre, only in the context of the ironic melodrama of Victorian parlor music. But in a note that Butler adds in 1902, he wrote it was in this libretto that there are not only the wanderings of a real Ulysses, but is such a beginning of a deflection which I little foresaw, but over which I now rejoice. So if the author is important for Butler, also this Ulysses that has the same title of James Joyce's masterpiece was very important. Now we need to talk about so basically why Samuel Butler tells us that the authoress of the Odyssey was a woman. First of all, the religious respect for the deities, the strongly feminine jealousy of Calypso towards Penelope. But what is particularly important for me is this point that in Hades, Anticlia recommends her son to return home as soon as possible to tell about his adventure in Hades to Penelope. So some scholars say that these characteristics, this point is more characteristic of a female that of a male. And another important point is the everyday life scene, the daily life scene that we found in the Homer's Odyssey. Because when Butler talks about the way women are, he combines what he has experienced himself with very conventional notions of gender derived from his Victorian milieu. So what happens here? Sarah Dara tells us, okay, Butler talks about, say that in Hades, Anticla recommends his son to come back to Penelope. And here we find also the everyday life scenes. We are not, it's the Odyssey, you know, it's not the Iliad, so we have everyday men and women. And Saradar tells us, moves to the author his first critics, because when Butler talks about the way women are, he combines what he has experienced himself with the very conventional notions of gender derived from his Victorian milieu. And for him, women have a very visceral attachment to their physical surroundings and the objects that make up their worlds. The author's imagination, he claims, devised various situations from her real life experience. So this is one of the, I'm not saying worst, but it's one of the biggest critics that scholars move to Samuel Butler. And it's for this reason that his author was mainly criticized. But Henry Jones, a friend and the first supporter of the English writer of Samuel Butler, said that Miss Anne Savage, known well, the writer was in New Zealand, influenced Butler in writing the authors. But now, what I found particularly interesting and particularly radical, as I said before, is the role that Butler gives to his authors. Because at this time, Sicily, as a context, Sicilian context, wasn't even so advanced as other nations, and as well as our northern counterparts when it comes to fight for women's rights. So it has to be clear, Butler wasn't a feminist at all. But in the first, it was in the first chapter of the authors that he claims that here Samuel Butler is taking few lines of an article of Times published in February 4, 1897. And the author of this article say that the sex difference is the profoundest and the most far-reaching that exists among human beings. But woman will act after the manner of woman, which is not and never can be the manner of men. So can here, you know, these are not a feminist words, or as we intend, as we, I mean, yeah, it's not a feminist because maybe he didn't okay, I'm losing myself again. This article is everything but feminist. But I have to say that Butler didn't talk about an inferiority of women. He recognizes the difference between men and women, and then he gave the woman the part of the protagonist of his Odyssey's wanderings. So as now regarding Butler's places, and as already stated, according to the author, Scheria would coincide with Trapani, and Ithaca would be the Isle of Marettimo, about which the author claims, as you can read. through the writer, when she has to consider Ithaca ab extra of an island and nothing more, pictures it to herself as the high and striking island of Marettimo, some 22 miles from Trapani. When she wants details, she takes them from from her own immediate neighborhood on the mainland. So basically, the author takes details from the reality around her, and precisely from Trapani. So Trapani and Marettimo comes to coincide anyway if Ithaca was identified with the isle from far 22 miles from Trapani. So, but why the author thinks that Trapani and the Egadi Islands are the places of the Odyssey? Because basically for three reasons. The town must be placed on a point of land jutting out as a land's end into the sea between two harbors or bays in which ships could ride, and it must be connected with the mainland by a narrow neck of land, and it must have a formidable rock at the entrance of one of the harbors. There must be no river running into either harbor, or Nausicaa wouldn't have had to go so far to wash her clothes. And there must be a notable mountain at no great distance from the town, so as to give point to Neptune's treat he would bury in under a high mountain. So here it's interesting because Samuel Butler, let's say that he found a reason to say that Trapani is the real Scheria, and Marettimo is coincides to his Ithaca, because Butler say Thucydides tells us that Phocians are those from Troy and can only mean Thracians settled at Mount Eryx. So Butler thinks that Thucydides is talking about Mount Eryx, so it comes to coincide. And in Butler's opinion, he thinks that scholar will ignore the fact that it was Thucydides who says that the Thracians settled there in his history of the Peloponnesian War, because this work, as I said before, was very criticized, especially from the classicists of Cambridge. So Butler tells us this thing that he was pretty sure that they will ignore his work. So which are now I talked about Samuel Butler, but which are the aspects in common between Butler and Joyce? Here is Richard Hellman, again telling us that Joyce had already come to the conclusion that thanks to Butler's masterpiece, Joyce had already come to the conclusion that every artist is womanly man and or mainly a woman. And this sentence makes me think, because when I decided to present this speech, because in Scylla and Charybdis, so Ulysses, as I said, has 18 episodes, and Scylla and Charybdis is of course one of them, and in this episode that is based on several opposition, he tries to justify the female personality traits in Leopold Paula Bloom and the masculine traits of Molly Bloom. As you see, in fact, Scylla, and as I said, Leopold Bloom has a very important feminine part in him, and I think this is one of the most great aspects to consider. But I wanna go here and in telling you which other aspects are the most important in common between Joyce and Butler. And I found also a strong predilection for the two authors for puns. So I know, I mean, as a Joyce's scholar to be, as I hope to be for the rest of my life, I totally know that in Joyce's masterpiece, Finnegans Wake, that was the last work of the author, we find, I mean, basically this book, if I can talk about a book, tend to coincide several language, and the Joyce in this latest book takes to extreme this puns using different languages, and he often combines two or more words in different language to create a new world, and the English language makes me gives me the possibility to joke with the word world and words. So Joyce is creating words, but also opens new worlds. So in different languages. And if you notice, one that's one of the most important Samuel Butler's masterpieces. Erewhon is the anagram of nowhere. So this joke remains also in Samuel Butler's, and I mean all the book is also I mean, yeah, satirical, but also we find these puns. And my favorite word of James Joyce's Finnegans Wake is this word, is the word cosmos. And this the quote: "Every person, place, and thing in the cosmos of," because here we find two concepts. We find my beloved chaos, but that coincides with the order of the cosmos. So here is just an example, but I think that you know, reading Finnegans Wake is not easy, because this book is written like that: "Away, alone, alas, aloft, along the river run." Fastive and Adam from. So here what happens? These are the last words of the Finnegans Wake, or of our Finnegans Wake, and river run is the first word of the first part of the book. So this circular, we have this circular, this circular book that never ends. In this way, this masterpiece never ends. So another sentence by Richard about this essay, an important essay by Richard Ellman, is that Butler's identification of the woman author with Nausicaa encouraged Joyce to allow both Nausicaa and Penelope, but I would also add Circe, to have their say in his own book. So here also in Joyce, women are have a fundamental role. Because we you know, Joycean, not Joycean, but scholars in general tend to think that Leopold Bloom is the only protagonist of that Leopold Bloom is the only protagonist of the Ulysses. Yeah, they had Stephen Dedalus, but Molly Bloom could be also defined as the co-protagonist of the Joycean masterpiece set on June 16. Of course, the author chooses this date because it is the date on which he meets Nora for the first time, and she will become his wife. So, as I said before, we tend to define Homer's Odyssey and Joyce's Ulysses as the book of Ulysses and of Leopold Bloom, and we don't consider the fact that too later we remember that both Penelope and Molly Bloom are protagonists in absentia. But they definitely influence the wanderings and decision of our male protagonists. And in this regard, I would like to propose you, I think Wallace Stevens, Don't Say to Leopardi, but is my favorite poet of every literature, because he composed these lines here. So she has composed, talking about Penelope in Homer's Odyssey. She has composed so long, a set with which to welcome him, companion to his self for her, which she imagined. Two in a deep founded shelterings, friend and their friend. The trees had been mentioned as an essential exercise in an inhuman meditation, larger than her own. No winds like dogs washed over her at night. She wanted nothing he could not bring her by coming alone. She wanted no fetchings. His arms would be her necklace and her belt, the final fortune of their desire. So in Stevens' poetry, but also in Homer verses, we immediately notice how two destinies separated for 20 years manage to reconcile and become one. Ulysses here is the first term of the metaphor, but it is Penelope who becomes the sailor who escaped the shipwreck. And to save him from the shipwreck will be, in Ulysses, in James Joyce Ulysses, will be Molly, who at the end of that June 16 will welcome him after a whole day of perdition, just like Nora Barnacle and just like Penelope did with their mates. So
Thank you very much for your talk. That was absolutely fascinating. It was really wonderful. And James Joyce is, such an iconic novelist. So I would like to open up the floor for questions. So the way we're going to do this is you can either type in a question in the Q&A section, or if you would like just to ask, raise your hand and you can unmute yourself and then you can talk. So we look like we have one question coming from Kellie. So go ahead, Kellie.
Thank you so much for your talk. I haven't read Ulysses, although it is on my list. I was curious, the one quote that you had by Richard Ellman, "Every artist is a womanly man or manly a woman."
Yeah.
Is that was that quote used by Simone de Beauvoir in A Second Sex? Do you know? I think she has something similar. I was just curious if you knew of that.
No, but if you can you repeat me the...
I'll send you the author's name, Simone de Beauvoir. She's a feminist.
Yeah.
She develops an idea of feminism, like around a similar concept. And so I was just curious if those were connected at all, or if you had seen any overlap in your research.
This is amazing, and thank you for your input, because the idea of the artist as an androgen was from Shakespeare. So Joyce took it from Shakespeare, but it would be nice to read also other point of view. And thank you.
I'll send it to you in the chat. Yeah.
Okay.
That's amazing. Thank you.
All right. We have another question here from Gabriele. Gabriele, go ahead.
Yes. Thank you very much for your talk. And
thank you for listening.
I'm not sure I can start my video. I cannot see.
Don't worry.
In any case, yeah, I just wondered if could expand a bit more on maybe two small points. So maybe about the relevance of the feminine figure also in the Ulysses. The fact that the final words of the novel are actually given to Molly, and the famous stream of consciousness monologue that she has at the end. Yes, I said I will. Yes, that piece. Yeah. So, and so this is part of the question. So how do you? If you could expand on, I mean, maybe the importance of assigning the final words of the masterpiece to the feminine character.
Yes, it was, Gabriele. Thank you for your question, because I was undecided if I could add this the last word of Ulysses, of James Joyce Ulysses, to this presentation, because I wasn't sure if all the panelists and all the people here had read Ulysses. But thank you, because in James Joyce's Ulysses, the final word is Molly's yes. And how can we read this yes? We can read it only if we accept that one, James Joyce, not a barnacle for Joyce, was the most important woman of his life, but she wasn't the only one, because James Joyce was depicted many times as a traitor, and we can see this by in every woman of his Ulysses. But who finished his masterpiece? Molly Bloom, Penelope, who is the Nora Barnacle of the situation, hence his masterpiece like this. And her yes is like if she wants to accept him and welcome him again, and only together we can start again a life and continue their life, because if not, Leopold Bloom would have wandering again and again through the streets of Dublin. So Nora Barnacle and Molly are that yes was the most important, one of the most important aspects of Ulysses.
Thank you. I don't know if there are any other questions. Thank you.
We have one more question left, and then we have to move on because we're a little bit behind schedule here. Lisa, go ahead.
Right. Thank you so much for a great talk. I was just curious about the Samuel Butler's letters and how women are perceived in those letters. Are they conventional roles in terms of the Victorian era, or does he tap into non-conventional engagement?
Absolutely non-conventional, because his sister May was one of the most important. Samuel Butler wasn't married, Okay, and he went to New Zealand, and here, as Henry Jones said, met Miss Anne Savage, and Butler writes this into his letter, and it's I guess I'm going to expand my researches on these letters, because here we find position not at all conventional, and this is a good point, a good starting point for our research on this epistle of Samuel Butler's epistolary. So thank you for your question, and I hope I follow you on Twitter, so I hope I can upload you with news, with some news. But yes, are unconventional, really unconventional.
Allora, tantissime grazie. Okay.
Oh, ma prego.
Grazie. Okay, ciao, ciao.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Marika. That was wonderful, and we really appreciate it. And thank you for presenting at our conference.
Thank you.
So next up, we have, sorry, excuse me. We have Krenare, and I think you pronounce your last name as Recaj?
Yep.
Great, awesome. So Krenare Recaj is currently an MA student in history at the University of Waterloo. She graduated from the University of Waterloo with honors and distinction in 2019 with a double major in history and religious studies and a minor in Mennonite studies. Her research interests include the history of Canadian foreign affairs and Canadian constitutional history. Krenare is currently writing her MA thesis on the history of Canada's foreign affairs with Kosovo, with a focus on domestic issues, influence on foreign policy. More broadly, Krenare is interested in overlooked factors in Canada's foreign policy decision-making and is currently applying for PhD programs and expects to begin her PhD in September 2021. So without ado, take it away for Kosovo, the battle, and the war.
All right, my screen is being shared. You can see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Perfect.
And I will just so you know, I will also, I mean, take your time, but I'll send you a chat message if we get close to the end of the time allotted.
Okay, perfect. I'd like to start you all I'd like to start by thanking you all for being here. It's been a great symposium over these last 2 days. I have learned so much, so it's been really good. Unlike many of you, I am not a scholar of classics or religious studies. I am a modern historian studying Canada's relationship with Kosovo from the 1990s to the present, placing me firmly within recent history. However, while researching Canada's relationship with Kosovo in the 1990s, I quickly realized how often references to ancient events and ancient ethnic hatreds came up. That led me to this paper, which looks at how ancient events in other parts of the world influence contemporary events in Canada, for better or for worse. The 1990s were marked with crisis after crisis in the Balkans. In the spring of 1991, both Slovenia and Croatia declared their independence. In Slovenia, there was a 10-day war between separatists and Yugoslavia before the withdrawal of the Yugoslav army. The war in response to Croatia's declaration of independence lasted significantly longer. It did not end until 1995. Bosnia declared independence in 1992, which initiated a bloody war with the Yugoslav army. Canada was involved in the Balkans through diplomacy and through sending peacekeeping forces to Bosnia. In 1999, Canada's full attention turned to Kosovo when Canada participated in NATO's Operation Allied Force. The 78-day bombing campaign against Yugoslavia meant to end the ethnic cleansing of Kosovar Albanians. My MA thesis is on diplomacy and domestic decision-making surrounding Canada's involvement in the Kosovo War. But while reading books on the events of 1999, I was struck by how many authors and academics referenced vague ancient hatreds and mythologized the entire Balkans, which led to this paper. I'm now going to read you quotes so you have a better idea of what I am talking about. Canadian military historian Sean Maloney, in his book on Canada's post-war stabilization efforts in Kosovo, describes Kosovo's location as within the little shop of horror called the Balkans. In another section of the same book, he asserts that there are no easy or straightforward explanations for anything that happens in the Balkans. In American historian David Fromkin's book on the Kosovo War, he says, "To the outside world, the Balkan Peninsula often has been pictured as a land time forgot, of peasant villages from the Middle Ages, of feuds and clans, of conspiracies and assassinations. And Europe, if in particular, remembers it, within reason, as a political labyrinth in which great powers, if imprudent enough to enter it, can end up losing their way or their lives." In his book on the Balkans, University of Toronto professor and Balkan specialist Robert Austin says, "According to the cliche, in the Balkans there is too much history in too small a space." Austin is likely referring to Winston Churchill's remarks on the Balkans, which are also quoted in retired American diplomat David Phillips' book on Kosovo. In the words of Winston Churchill, "The Balkans produce more history than they can consume." Finally, my favorite quote, also by Dr. Robert Austin: "Kosovo and the Balkans are like Hotel California. You can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave." I could go on and on with similar quotes. I know as academics, there is a pressure for us to make our research seem interesting and relevant. Imagining the Balkans as a place stuck in time or a labyrinth does make the Balkans more interesting. But this type of mythologizing illustrated in these quotes I just read is commonplace in the historiography of the Balkans. Despite its prevalence, this type of description is neither useful nor accurate. If anything, it is counterproductive to the academic pursuit.
You're back.
So sorry, my internet went down.
Okay, that's fine.
A little bit of panic. I'll keep going.
Okay, that sounds great. Thank you.
Okay. All right. The problem is that this type of rhetoric goes beyond academia. Such mythologizing of the Balkans was also prevalent among politicians. When discussing Kosovo, Prime Minister Recaj referred to ancient hates and grievances. New Democratic Party MP Peter Mancini referred to ancient grudges and ancient hatreds, and Progressive Conservative Member of Parliament Charlie Power commented, "The history of the whole Balkan area and the nature of many years, hundreds of years of conflict and hatred, which have existed in that area and have flourished for some strange reason." References to ancient hatreds that have prevailed for some strange reason obfuscate the responsibility of politicians and policies in creating conflict in the contemporary world. Some scholars, such as journalist Tim Judah and the author of Kosovo, War and Revenge and Kosovo, What Everyone Needs to Know, and historian Noel Malcolm, the author of Kosovo, A Short History, have taken on the task of explaining the Balkans and Kosovo without mythologizing or vilifying that is so present. Malcolm explains that the prevailing Western view of Balkan conflicts was always that these ethnic conflicts created by the bubbling of obscure but virulent ethnic ancient hatreds among the local populations. This whole approach to the subject is essentially false. It ignored the primary role of politicians in creating conflict at the political level. Unfortunately, these scholars who have taken the time to look beyond the Balkan mythology are in the minority. When politicians refer to ancient ethnic hatreds, they are most likely referring to the Battle of Kosovo. Whether they know so or not is a different question. The Battle of Kosovo took place on the 28th of June, 1389. In this battle, Serbian Prince Lazar and his forces were defeated by the Ottoman army at Fushkosov, Kosovo Polje, on the outskirts of Pristina. This defeat initiated 500 years of Ottoman rule. Tim Judah comments that surprisingly little is known about this famous battle. The reason for this is because the Battle of Kosovo not only initiated 500 years of Ottoman rule, it also initiated 600 years of nationalist myth-making on both the sides of the Albanians and the Serbians. What is known is that there were likely Albanians and Serbians fighting on both sides. The idea that this was a war with clear ethnic division is a product of propaganda and myth-making. In his book, Kosovo, What Everyone Needs to Know, Tim Judah states that Serbs have argued that Kosovo is the heart of Serbia. If that is the case, retort Albanians, then the Serbian heart beats in the foreign body. At the heart of this statement is the uncomfortable truth that both Albanians and Serbians believe that Kosovo rightfully belongs to them. What is important to understand is that Kosovo has been contested territory for hundreds of years, and the relevant ancient events are obscured by national myths on both sides. At this point, it would be useful to go over what we know so far. First, Canada was involved in the Balkans for basically the entire 1990s, and by March of 1999 was at war with the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. Second, historians and academics who write about this period mythologize the Balkans, and similarly, politicians at the time referred to the Balkans as a place of ancient hatreds without naming what they are referring to. Third, as academics, we know that these unnamed references likely referred to the 600-year-old battle in Kosovo. The Battle of Kosovo has been shrouded by so much propaganda and nationalist myth-making on both sides that little of the actual events can be verified. Both Serbians and Albanians draw their identity and their claim to Kosovo from this battle. Before we look at how the Battle of Kosovo cropped up as an issue referenced in Canada, we have to look at how it re-emerged in Yugoslavia. In 1987, Ivan Stambolic was the president of Serbia, and Slobodan Milosevic was a mid-level party official in Serbia's Communist Party. In 1988, Milosevic was sent to Kosovo to listen to the complaints of Kosovo Serbs. Capitalizing on the ethnic tensions present between Kosovo and Albanians and Kosovo Serbians, Milosevic made a speech in which he told Kosovo Serbians that no one should dare beat you. The entire atmosphere surrounding the speech was crafted to inflame nationalist fervor. Instead of taking place in Pristina, the capital city of Kosovo, it took place in a town Albanians called Fush Kosov and Serbians called Kosovo Polje, translated to the Field of the Blackbirds. The Field of the Blackbirds is where the Battle of Kosovo happened in 1389. Milosevic knew what he was doing, and the nationalist fervor that resulted from Milosevic's visit directly led to his rise in power. In his book on the Balkans, Robert Austin exclaims that anyone who wants to see a man transformed in a moment need only watch the footage of Milosevic in Kosovo. Milosevic continued to capitalize on tensions in Kosovo in order to consolidate his power. Shortly after his speech, Milosevic secured the resignation of Ivan Stambolic, priming himself for power. In 1988, he exhumed the bones of Prince Lazar, who was killed at the Battle of Kosovo, and toured them throughout Kosovo and Yugoslavia. The bones of a dead prince being toured around Kosovo was an ominous sign of what was yet to come in the region. With Milosevic's instruction, the Serb National Assembly revoked Kosovo and Vojvodina's autonomous status. To do so, they needed the support of the provincial assemblies of Kosovo and Vojvodina. Milosevic secured this support through a combination of jailing opponents and holding provincial assembly votes under duress. On the 26th of March, 1989, the Kosovo Assembly, surrounded by tanks, ratified a new constitution. Kosovo was no longer an autonomous province. On the 28th of June, 1989, the 600th anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo, Milosevic celebrated his political ascendancy with a charged speech in which he challenged political opponents in Serbia and Albanians in Kosovo. Again, Milosevic made his speech from Fush Kosov, or Kosovo Polje, the Field of the Blackbirds. The importance of these events in Kosovo to the whole history of Yugoslavia cannot be overstated. According to Malcolm, the Yugoslavia crisis began in Kosovo and it will end in Kosovo. Similarly, Austin stated, what happened in Kosovo sent Yugoslavia into a series of unending crises, and there is no doubt that Kosovo caused Yugoslavia's disintegrations. Judah concurs and explains that by stripping Kosovo of its autonomy and using tanks to do so, Milosevic instilled fear elsewhere, which in turn fueled the rise of nationalism in other parts of the country. In that sense, those who argue that the end of Yugoslavia began right in Kosovo are right. On this slide, there are two photos of Milosevic's famous speech. Notice on the lower photo, the year 1389, referring to the Battle of Kosovo. Between this and the touring of Prince Lazar's bones, nothing about Milosevic's plans were subtle. These events show us that ancient events are often inextricably tied to current ones, and how important it is for policymakers and academics to understand the ancient history they reference. Unfortunately, politicians in Canada often do not take the time to fully understand the ancient events that they reference. In Canadian House of Commons in 1988, Progressive Conservative Member of Parliament Andrew Whiter invited all Canadians to join in celebrating Serbian Day and to commemorate an important event in Serbian history, the Battle of Kosovo. As we can see, while the Battle of Kosovo was being commemorated with the parading of a dead prince's bones and with the intentional fueling of ethnic hatreds in Yugoslavia, Canadian MPs were commemorating the events in the House of Commons as well. This is not a criticism of the MP Whiter, as celebrating the cultural day of Canada's diaspora communities is commonplace. However, it does serve as an important lesson about the importance of knowing what is being commemorated and why. In March of 1999, many issues of Maclean's were largely dedicated to covering the Kosovo War. One of the articles quotes a taxi driver in Serbia saying, "I don't like Milosevic very much, but when it comes to Kosovo, we are united." The same article describes a couple in Serbia who firmly refused to blame the bombing on Milosevic and quotes the mother passionately asserting, "The greatest thing for Serbs is to have a son, but I will be happy if he goes to fight in Kosovo, even if we become a second Vietnam." These quotes clearly illustrate the central role Kosovo played in Serbian nationalism. This type of rhetoric was mirrored by the Serbian community in Canada. As discussed, the Battle of Kosovo was central to this nationalism. In one article, journalist Peter C. Newman asks a Serbian Canadian in Vancouver how he feels about the ethnic cleansing of Albanians in Kosovo. The man being interviewed responded by asking, "Don't you remember June 28, 1389? The man went on to explain to the journalist Newman the Battle of Kosovo's history and explained, "To us, it's holy ground. To bomb and machine gun Serb soldiers won't make much difference. Their place will be taken by their grandfathers and their teenage children. Ours is a strong culture. We shall never surrender. We need to remember the Battle of Kosovo." This is a pertinent example of one of the defining qualities of a country of immigrants. Immigrants become fully fledged citizens and they bring many things with them to Canada, including their national identity, national narratives, and national myths. The importance of Canada's diaspora and cultural communities in Canada's foreign policy decision-making is well established. On October 28, 1998, the Member of Parliament for Niagara Falls presented a petition that was given to him at the celebration in his riding for the 53rd Serbian Day. According to the Hansard, the petitioners, a large number for Niagara Falls, are calling upon this House to consider very carefully the situation that is developing presently in Kosovo. Again, this is tied to the Battle of Kosovo of 1389. The circumstances surrounding this petition highlight the realities of diaspora communities in Canada, as analyzed above. On Serbian Day, a day that commemorates the Battle of Kosovo of 1389 and which is extremely important to Serbian nationalism, a Canadian politician was handed a petition regarding Canada's involvement in then present-day Kosovo. This illustrates how diaspora communities merge beliefs in nationalism from their homelands, along with their past, and the political system in Canada in the present, in an attempt to ultimately influence foreign policy. The reality of living in a multicultural society in a globalized world is that centuries-old events, half a world away, affect contemporary Canada. Historians, academic, journalists, and politicians have a responsibility to understand the ancient ethnic events and hatreds they refer to when writing about places like the Balkans. When commemorating cultural events in Canada, politicians should be wary of the implications and context of those celebrations. Although not easily achieved, A better understanding of ancient events and their significance is integral to the governing of the country.
Thank you very much. That was absolutely fascinating. Despite the little glitch in the middle, we got through it pretty good. And thank you very much for continuing on. So yeah, what we'll do is we'll look at some, we'll see if there's any questions. Again, I'll remind you, if you don't want to speak or be on the recording, you can just submit your question through the Q&A. We have a question here from Dr. Lisa Hughes. Go ahead, Doctor.
Great, Krenare, thank you so much for a really engaging presentation. This is more about a comment as opposed to a question. So I just, I really want to emphasize the importance of your talk in the sense of thinking about, number one, the intersections of with other papers that in the conference so far, thinking about the appropriation of relics, notions of identity, theories of entanglement. This offered a really good starting point to think about those particular issues in the ancient world themselves and how we handle them. But what I really wanted to emphasize is the importance, right, of what this means for public engagement, right? This is your paper beautifully highlighted the importance, and particularly in the climate that we're currently in, where education is in terms of some political views is being undermined in certain ways, but to value the importance of collaboration and working through these ideas, because they have a much broader implications on all of this. So just a huge thank you for your talk.
Thank you for that feedback. I find it really useful. And indeed, it's the idea of the past being so relevant today and not dismissing that.
Great, thank you, Lisa. We have a question here from Mitchell. He asked, does the rhetoric of the Balkans being torn by old hatreds change when politicians decide to intervene politically or militarily? On the surface, it seems like a narrative against intervention.
It is a narrative against intervention because the Serbian opponents to intervention, especially in Canada, were making claims to the territory based on 1389. When you compare where Canada was in 1389, you think about then the Indigenous claims that could happen based on that. And I had the opportunity to interview Minister Lloyd Axworthy, who was the Foreign Affairs Minister at the time. And he said he had to repeatedly not dismiss it because he didn't want to say, oh, it's just ancient history, but he had to repeatedly say that Canada has to protect its own interests now, and our interests now were humanitarian issues, not whether or not a prince died or didn't die in 1389.
Great, thank you very much. Is there any other questions or comments, feedback? Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. And
we really appreciate you attending this conference. And that was an absolutely fascinating talk. I mean, I have friends who actually served over in Kosovo, and it was nice to hear someone actually presenting on this particular topic and creating the relevancy that the past does have still in today's world.
Thank you. Thanks for that feedback. All right.
All right. Next, we have coming up is our very own Kellie Cornforth. Kellie is actually a first-year religious studies graduate student here at the University of Calgary. Her research focuses on understanding the role of or function of religion in secular society. When not studying, she enjoys mastering new recipes to enjoy with her dinner club. That sounds like a great time. I'd be into that too. So go ahead, Kellie, you're up.
Yeah, so I just wanted to start off by thanking the CLARE Graduate Symposium and the conference committee for hosting this event. I've learned so much, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be able to share some of my thinking with you all today. With COVID, I'm in this room alone a lot, so it's a real pleasure to be able to engage with others, and I look forward to some comments and questions at the end. I was really excited to dig into the question, How do the humanities and social sciences maintain relevancy in the modern world? I don't necessarily have any answers, but I really enjoyed the opportunity to think more deeply about how my general field of study, religious studies, might maintain relevancy. And I think there's one fairly obvious possibility, and that would be to continue studying religion. But this leads me to the question, how does religion maintain relevancy in the modern world? Now, I only have 20 minutes and I'm just in my first year of grad school, so I'm proposing a modest suggestion. But I argue that religion is not only relevant, it's actually growing. And I hope to come to this conclusion not merely by manipulating the definition and category of religion so it encompasses everything, but to show that non-religion and religion, or secular and religious life, are not opposed in some zero-sum game. Rather, non-religion, which would include atheists, agnostics, and humanists, are growing out of religious traditions and transforming belief to suit a modern context. And while the non-religious certainly hold a belief system that sometimes contradicts traditional religious belief systems, the two are not mutually exclusive. And if we accept the complex connection between non-religion and religion, we might be able to see non-religious practices as shaping and transforming beliefs to offer new languages of faith. So here's sort of the agenda for today. I'm going to look at two different versions of secularism to interpret religious affiliation in Canada, and I'll focus primarily on Charles Taylor's variety of secularism developed in his book, A Secular Age. And I'll use this as a framework to analyze the role of humanist chaplains in order to highlight the complexity of the non-religious religious binary to ultimately show that non-religion is one option of belief among many. So there's a common assumption that public life is secular, having no religious or spiritual basis, which is seen as the inevitable product of modernity. The desire to separate church and state can be traced back to the Enlightenment thinkers, and here are a few. These gentlemen wanted to find a new social order devoid of religious justification because in their minds, social progress could not be imagined without liberation from previous social and political institutions and the religious ties that had justified them. So the new social order that would be free from religion was thought to be secular. And this develops into the notion of religion being contained and removed from public institutions, leaving behind a value-free and objective space. From this perspective, secularism is a framework of non-religious ideas that is explicitly contrasted with religion. And to be a secularist is to adopt a stance toward life that clearly separates religion from non-religious ways of being. So here we have this really clear division of what is religion and what is secular. In Canada, the 2011 National Household Survey reported that approximately 24% of the Canadian population identifies as non-religious. And so that would be, like I said, atheists, agnostics, and humanists. And this number has been steadily growing from 12% in 1991 to 16% in 2001. And as you can see, the non-religious are the second largest category to be identified by the survey after Roman Catholicism, with approximately 39% of the population. And in 2012, a Project Canada surveys reported that approximately 40% of Canadians have never attended a church service, and only 30% attend on a monthly basis. So if we accept the notion that secular or non-religious is what remains once we throw out religion with all of its superstition, ritual, belief in God, then the rising number of non-religious people identified in the survey might be evidence to prove religious practice is declining. But I think this understanding of secularism is unsatisfactory, and I have Charles Taylor on my side, and here he is. In his book, A Secular Age, Taylor argues that secularism is not just unbelief or lack of religious belief. It is the product of intellectual multiplication and reflects a context in society where various forms and modes of belief are possible. So the book is notoriously long and he says a lot of things, but as it relates to this presentation, he makes two important points about secularism. One, secularism is not a distilled state of neutrality. Instead, it is produced out of Latin Christendom and Protestantism. So this means that we can't separate non-religious from its religious forebears. The two are necessarily intertwined. And two, secularism represents a multiplicity of options. This means that non-religious, atheists, or humanists are legitimate options among others. Now, Taylor's pretty clear that non-belief is not the best option to choose, but he recognizes it as a legitimate option nonetheless. And both of these points need to be understood in reference to each other. Latin Christendom and Protestantism produced secularism, which is a context that presents individuals with a variety of religious options, including the option of being non-religious. Taylor uses the metaphor of a supernova to describe the exploding options of belief coming out of the Enlightenment. In this understanding of secularism, the rising number of Canadians identifying as non-religious does not necessarily prove that religious belief is declining. Instead, we could see religious belief as one option among many. And to develop this point, I'd like to examine the role of humanist chaplains, particularly in hospital settings, as a current example to develop Taylor's version of secularism. And I'll then move to show that non-religious expressions, such as humanist chaplaincy, are in fact offering new and creative expressions of belief as part of an ongoing transformation of religion. Chaplains were traditionally priests in the Catholic tradition who were charged with looking after chapels, chaplain. And references to chaplains in hospitals emerge in the early 11th century. And it's somewhat unclear exactly what their role was, but generally chaplains were considered to be a friend to the sick and the poor, a guide for church ritual, and brought theology into the hospital setting. And by the early 1900s, the chaplain's role achieved greater definition by offering sacraments and scripture to maintain a focus on God during patients' illness. After World War I, this traditional role of chaplaincy was challenged by veterans who were unwilling to accept traditional religious doctrine, but still required some support to make meaning in the wake of devastating wartime experiences. So in this context, humanist chaplaincy emerged as a practice aimed at strengthening existential resilience using the humanist worldview. This gentleman, Jaap van Praag, is noted as a key figure in advancing the profession of humanist chaplaincy in healthcare, prisons, and the army. We can talk about all the white dudes in my presentation at the end, but he offered humanist chaplaincy not in opposition to the dominant Protestant or Catholic theology of the time, but as an alternative to those who did not prescribe to a particular religious tradition. He recognized the value of spiritual care, and instead of using theology or doctrine to guide people in making meaning, he wanted to use a humanist framework. So humanism is a worldview or attitude which prioritizes the individual, reason, and interpersonal connection over a supernatural entity. And this last part is fundamentally important to the humanists. They do not believe that there exists a supernatural entity that intervenes in the natural world. The Humanist Chaplaincy Network claims to make sense of the world using reason and evidence while rejecting superstition. And they say that their outlook is guided by rational thought, focused on the importance of human cooperation and compassion for solving problems. Essentially, they believe that you can live a good life without God. And this conception of humanism feels vaguely similar to me to the concept of secularism that was developed by the Enlightenment thinkers, in this idea that humanism is what remains once superstition is rejected, which is peculiar to me because they go on to say, and they being the Humanist Chaplaincy Network, A humanist chaplain provides pastoral care based on humanist principles. The humanist chaplain gives information and consultation about existential questions. But how can a non-religious, secular, humanist chaplain provide pastoral care? It seems a bit of a paradox to me, and yet this form of spiritual care is alive and well. Alberta Health Services, or AHS, currently employs 36 spiritual care practitioners, and their role is to foster spiritual well-being in patients and families, recognizing that spiritual health is an important component of patient overall well-being. And the spiritual care practitioners were previously called chaplains, but they recently changed their title to encompass greater religious diversity. And spiritual care practitioners will attend to patients of all faith, including people who might have no religious affiliation. And spiritual care practitioners themselves affiliate with various religious traditions, including humanism. They are trained to embrace a holistic approach, attending to an individual's unique beliefs, values, behaviors, and experiences of spirituality, religion, culture, and/or the transcendent. The Canadian Association for Spiritual Care notes that the majority of people facing serious illness show signs of spiritual distress, and the provision of spiritual care offers benefits such as increased patient satisfaction, increased patient engagement with healthcare decisions, faster recovery from illness, and decreased lengths of stay in hospital. So in this example, the non-religious religious distinction is not particularly clear. We have humanist chaplains offering spiritual care to non-religious patients in secular hospital institutions. And I haven't even had time here to mention the atheist minister leading a congregation in the United Church of Canada, which is a whole nother thing. So the fact that non-religion and religion can't be so easily separated reflects the multiplicity and interconnectedness that Taylor identifies in his version of secularism. And if we refer back to those two key points on secularism that we discussed earlier, humanist chaplaincy emerges out of the Christian tradition and continues as a practice of providing pastoral care. And it represents one option among others for patients facing spiritual distress. So if secular humanism is not separate or opposed to religion, what is it? And I argue that it is a practice that is creatively imagining new forms of religious searching. Taylor's secularism identifies a new culture that has altered the conditions in which religion and faith can flourish. In an article by Peter Gallagher, he summarizes Taylor by saying, Taylor insists that the faith crisis of today's world calls for renewed forms and languages of faith. What has declined in his interpretation of cultural secularism is a set of ecclesial priorities and expressions that suited another moment in culture. What is needed is a creative discernment of the underlying hungers of the present situation that seems so secular, but may often be expressing a spiritual hunger for fullness. The 2012 Project Canada survey found that 53% of Canadians report that they engage in religious or spiritual activities on their own at least once a month. 3 out of 4 people acknowledge they have spiritual needs, yet many of these people no longer are interested in committing to a religious organization. This might reflect the spiritual but not religious crowd, although I'm hesitant to give them too much credence, as their very marker for identification is dependent on what they oppose, that being religion. And if we take Taylor's version of secularism seriously, non-religious expressions or spirituality is not a lack of religion, but a product of history where religion is inevitably intertwined. And so I think this 53% of Canadians engaging in religious or spiritual activities on their own, along with the 24% identifying as non-religious and the 36 spiritual care practitioners with AHS, reflect a renewed form of language of faith. And what is required now is a creative discernment to get to the underlying hungers of the present situation. Given all this, I think that religious studies scholars have a lot of work to do to understand the growing multiplicity of religious practice. And the intention of my research is to ensure that non-religious are not overlooked as we examine religion in our secular society. Thank you so much for your attention.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kelly. That was fascinating. I love it. I don't really get to see much of that kind of religious side, and especially with secularism, never really looked into it that much. So it's nice to hear what your work is about, and especially where, you know, in the Zoom where we haven't got to meet in person yet.
One day.
For that. So we'll open up the floor to some questions if anybody has any or comments. And we have something here. Lisa has a question. Go ahead, Lisa.
Hey, Kelly, thanks so much for a great talk. It was wonderful to learn where your research is going, and just being on the sidelines and watching all this come to fruition is really wonderful. My question is, so in terms of looking at terminology, with respect to terminology that we use, right? You're advocating for secular chaplain on the one hand, and we have spiritual care practitioners on the other. Are those first question, are those the only terms that are used to describe individuals with this particular vocation? And then two, do you think that secular chaplain is the term that you're going to move forward with as you proceed in your research?
Yes, thank you for that. As I was kind of working on this, I certainly felt the need to, as I continue to further define and clarify these terms. So I'm really glad that you brought that up. In AHS, in Alberta Health Services, the spiritual care practitioner is the term that they use. And that's a new title that replaced their previous title of chaplains. So that's kind of in the context of AHS. But there are humanist chaplains that identify themselves as that. So for example, you know, universities typically provide chaplaincy as a kind of resource to students. So, you know, at UC, we have many chaplains from different denominations, including, you know, religious faith traditions outside of just the Christian and Protestant tradition. And there are humanist chaplains that offer humanist, you know, support in other universities. So Harvard and MIT have, you know, Greg Epstein is their humanist chaplain, and he's advocating for this kind of particular role. So I'm not exactly sure how the two overlap, but I think there is more work that needs to be done there.
Yeah, no, it's just really interesting too, in the sense of, again, thinking about etymology, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what is, you know, if trying to reach a broader audience with all this too, I mean, thinking about the word chaplain in itself can be perceived, I think, by some as very, you know, monolithic, or if you will, for one particular tradition. Right.
Well,
and putting humanitarian or humanist, right, tagging that on, great, right, to try to bring it through. But I'm just wondering, again, do you think it's the way to go in the future?
I don't know. I mean, yeah, I think that's a good question. I don't, I think that AHS changed, like got rid of chaplaincy in order to make it appeal to a broader audience, so that people weren't assuming that it was going to be someone from a Catholic or Christian tradition offering some sort of theology or sacrament or something like that. So, and that's what I find so fascinating about the humanist chaplains is why are they keeping the chaplaincy title?
Yeah.
I don't know. I think that speaks to the fact that this that humanism is not, and secular is not something that's completely separate from religion, that they are intertwined somehow.
Great, thank you. It's great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Lisa. We have 3 more, and they all kind of came in at the same time. So I'm going to go with who I saw first and then move on from there. So we're going to start with Tinu, if you would like to unmute yourself and ask.
Sure, can you hear me there?
Yeah.
Doesn't give me a chance to turn on the video here, but Kellie, thanks so much for this talk. It's really, really clear and to the point. And I think you might know the sort of questions I might ask here, but one of them is really to, push you a little bit on this point that you made earlier about saying that, well, you don't want to play around with the definition of religion in order to kind of make it include everything. And I can understand that. At the same time, the definition of religion and, in this case, secularism and spirituality are really kind of crucial. So one question I had is whether you could talk a little bit about what you see in the literature as how people are defining spiritual in spiritual care and in the secularism research and things like that. And secondly, I wonder whether at one point I think you wanted to talk about non-religious as being one of the categories among many which secularism allows for. And given the issues of definition, and as you mentioned, the spiritual but not religious, religion is a kind of a foil for a lot of these kinds of things. I wonder if non-metaphysical would be a better way of describing what we're talking about here in terms of some kind of tradition, practice, beliefs, and things like that that don't go to the metaphysical, but are trying to get at something else, what they might call spiritual, which brings me to that question, what do they mean by that? But I like that point that you said that there are these underlying hungers. So anyway, a couple of questions, definitions, and the possibility of metaphysics being the key issue.
Yeah, thank you. I think that for the purposes of this presentation and the idea of engaging with a broader audience, I didn't want to focus on definitions because I think, and I mean, Taylor, I think kind of talks about this too, of, people have these sort of like emotional or kind of built-in ideas about religion or these underlying hunger of spirituality. And I think they are academically very difficult to define. And so I didn't want that to be the focus where I'm just trying to define and kind of locate and pin down these terms, but to sort of appeal to people's general sense of what this means and work from there, and perhaps complicate what people might originally perceive or assume to be religion and not religion, or religious life versus secular life. And I think spirituality is kind of one of these terms that is not very well defined, and I think in a lot of ways in the literature, and I need to do more work on this, but seems to fall into similar categories as religion. And so, but again, when people say I'm spiritual but not religious, there's a feeling behind that. There's something kind of that they're drawing from their social imaginary to assume these categories. So I'm kind of curious about that, of just sort of relying on what people kind of bring to these words. And I think the underlying hungers or what people are trying to get at, that's a very good question. I mean, Taylor, it really focuses on the transcendent as what will satisfy some of those underlying hungers. But I need to do a lot of more work in kind of understanding and yeah, making sense of that, really. I hope that kind of answers what you were getting at.
Yes, thanks very much.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Tina. We'll go on to we got two more here, and then we'll have to end it for this panel because we're a little bit over time, and I know people need to have a lunch break before our workshop. But we'll move on to Dr. Caroline Musick. And she writes, it seems that the word spiritual gives humanists and atheists a way to speak about what others might call pastoral religious guidance. I know this is a big question, but given this vagueness of the term spiritual, how do secular humanists, atheists define spiritual? Great paper. It kind of, I guess this one plays a little bit into what Tina was talking about.
Well, I think that the secular humanists, atheists, they don't, I'm trying to think. I mean, like, they're really focused on reason and intellect and being able to rationally discern the world in a way that aligns with materialistic or scientific understandings of nature. And so spirituality, from what I can think of just off the top of my head, it doesn't really play into the humanist worldview because they're so cautious of that supernatural entity or any sort of superstition. The only time where it really comes out is in this idea of humanist chaplaincy, where they're attending to people's spiritual well-being. So it is unclear. And yes, more work needs to be done. I'm not 100% sure, but it is a good question.
Great, thank you. And our last question comes from Mitchell. How do you see the normative, coercive aspects of religion contrasted with non-religion? Do you see secularism as normative?
I think, well, first of all, it's great to see you, Mitchell, or just that you're here. Thank you. I think that the idea of secularism as normative plays into that idea of secularism being objective or value-free, or some sort of this normal, clear space from which religion has been kind of cast out. And so I really I disagree with that view of secularism. And if anyone attended the talk yesterday, Safia brought up the idea of cultural, what was it? I wrote it down. But this idea of like, these these ideas come together and they form something new, and it's not about removing or finding the pure state somewhere. And I think that secularism plays into that. And so I don't think you can kind of weed out the coercive aspects of religion and then, find this normative space. I think they come together and exist in this context. And so you have to understand it within that.
Great.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for your questions. Really appreciate it. It was a fantastic panel and some really good talks here today. So we'll be ending it here.